Hi, this is Anne with Fiber Designs by Anne, and this is Coloring Textiles Part 6. We're going to do some rubbings. I'll be using Neocolor 2 wax pastels for my rubbings. You can try other things. This is just what I'll be using. I'll also be using a mist bottle. And if you don't want to invest in a set, some stores sell the Neocolors as a single stick instead of a whole set. I'm going to use a couple sheets of paper. I have a regular paper, printer paper, and cardstock. I have some different fabric. This is just a muslin. And then I have my Pima cotton that I like to use. This is also a good technique to use on some of the pieces that we maybe printed in the other or painted in the other series from Textile Coloring. That's what this is. You may want to use some stamps, and I have a variety of fabric that we'll try today. Not only stamps, I have a doily, I have some lace that has some relief, some texture to it. This is a very old quilting stencil. I'm not sure, I don't know where that came from because it's really old, but you could use a quilting stencil. This as a hand-cut stamp. I have a variety of, well, I'll say fibers, but they're not all fiber. This is, of course, tulle mesh, and I like the bigger holes, you get a better result. Some of these came from the workshop, I think. This is drywall tape, and I think this is another kind of mesh tape for construction type work. I have some mesh that are fabrics. I have burlap. This one is, I've taken some of the pieces out, so I have a little bit of a design. This is just straight burlap. And then these you might recognize as produce bags, different kind of mesh produce bags, which are plastic or some synthetic fabric. Then I have another fabric. This actually is fabric, but sometimes you could use like a drawer liner. That's what this is, a drawer liner that has texture. This is a screen, window screen mesh. And this is a little, just a little label funky thing I was playing around with, but I'm going to use the design here that is fabric and stitched. And there's a little batting under it, so it has a little more relief. I'm going to use that for one of my rubbings. I also took some items around the house. Containers. This is just a box that has a bumpy top, and I have a variety of, I have a shell, I have a variety of baskets that all have a different texture on the outside of them. I have this little hanger that came from a store, another basket, and another container that's plastic. So for these containers that I just showed you and the shell, I got these results. So this is from the basket that has the squares on the side. This is from this. I wiggled it a little so it's not a real pure design. It's a little, it looks kind of blurry, and sometimes that's a neat thing to do in a piece. This is from the top of this. So instead of leaving circles, it left dotted lines. This is from the basket that actually, the plastic that actually had a design that is like a, kind of like a basket. And this is even more like a woven piece. That's what this is. And this, of course, from the one that had the circles. And then this design came from the shell. To do a rubbing, you'll take the object, you'll put the fabric over it, you'll take a Neocolor 2, and you'll hold it with your hand and just do that, do a rubbing. Really like what the shell's doing, that's kind of fun. So that's holding with your hand, but sometimes that's kind of difficult. So we might use tape. I've used this big tape to do metal pieces, and I just make a sheet of it. I tape them together and make a sheet. And that's nice and sturdy, and so if I do coins or washers or other little metal pieces, like my metal gears, I'll show you that. They just get attached to the tape. You can use tape to just tape down the, if you're using any of those fibers that I showed, those meshes, you can use the tape to tape those down. And you can also use sandpaper to hold your object in place. If you use a freezer paper, what I do is take my mesh, and I would set my mesh down on the ironing surface, put my freezer paper on top, which I've already done here. Put the mesh down, put the freezer paper down, dry hot iron, and I might put a piece of parchment or a protective ironing surface over this. And just make sure whatever you're using, the iron isn't so hot that it doesn't melt this. That's why I don't do this with any of the meshes, because it will melt it. It just goes right through this paper. So you're going to attach it, and then that's just going to hold your what you're rubbing on steady for you. I have a lot of different fabrics here. I have, this is canvas, and it's not primed, it's just raw canvas, but it's kind of thick, and it actually still works for a rubbing. This is silk, so it's woven. And then I have organzas. I have a synthetic organza, and I have a silk organza. And just some, this is fabric that's a polyester, satiny kind of fabric, and it has a design already in it. You can kind of see that texture, and I haven't done a rubbing on that, so that's going to be fun to see if that design shows up. It should. And then I just have some unbleached muslin here. And this is a really good way to use up some of those fabrics that we did, as I said before, that we used that maybe weren't the best in our painting, that we did for the other the other parts in this series. So I'm going to start with this one. I'm going to, because I'm on my ironing surface, I'm going to put a harder surface under this. I'm going to take these colors. So I like this. These are my homemade stamps. And this is the top of the fabric, and I'm actually going to use the bottom of the fabric for this. I like the back side better. And again, this is sort of freestyle, so it's always a surprise. I was going to do that dragonfly in red, but I think I'm going to use blue. So all you do is lay your fabric on top of your pieces. Those are kind of weighty, and because they're not slick, well, the wax paper might make them move, but they'll stay pretty well in place. And you just lay your hand on it, and we'll see if this shows up on this fabric. And depending on how hard you rub, and I could have taped my fabric down so it wasn't so wiggly, but again, I'm just having fun, and I'm okay with that. Now I have a little plant down here. Oh, the other thing is, because when you're using a stamp, let me grab one. Because you're doing a stamp, when you're stamping, this is pretty symmetrical, but if it wasn't, if you're stamping, it's reversed, of course, but when you're doing a rubbing, it's exactly what you see on your stamp. Okay, so my little plant's down here. I just think this is a fun way to use up a fabric that you made in some of the other steps. And then the last one is my little sunshine. These were made for stamping, but it's fun to find other ways to use them. And I like that this is kind of giving me some sun rays off of there, so I think I'll just bring that up. Pull those over. Now those aren't real bright, and you could leave them just like that. I'm going to remove my stamps. And if you're just using them in a piece of art, you could just leave them like this. They will rub off if you're messing around with them too much. So I like to heat set them. So I'm putting my cardstock under here. As you learned probably in another part of the series, when you activate this pastel with water. So a couple things can happen here. You can spritz it with water. Well, first I would heat set it, so let me just do that first. So I'm taking another piece of paper and I'm putting it on top. And I'm just going to press over that wax pastel. And sometimes this makes it brighter too, because you're melting it into the fabric. I do that just so that it doesn't move quite as much. If you wanted it to really move, you could skip that step and go right to the spray. And you could use a paintbrush and brush it so that the design will probably stay mostly, if you're gentle. And then you can get more of the color sort of around the design. So I'm going to do this, spray it a little bit. You can see it gets a little bit brighter. And it will start to bleed, but that heating it slowed that down. So if you really don't want it to go too far, lay the paper on it again. And you can see that more of that's coming onto the paper. And then when I'm sure that the wax isn't going to transfer anymore, I would make it off my board for one thing. I would press it again to dry the fabric. So I'm just going to do it. And sometimes things transfer. If you're on solid white fabric, that's when it might show. It won't show too much on here. So that's kind of fun. So I'm going to go ahead and do some rubbings and you can watch. I'll use the different fabrics and white fabric and just sort of play. This is that piece I showed before. It's got a lot of different techniques going on. And actually for this rubbing, I'm going to use the back. I think that's so pretty. And it makes me think of water. So I'm going to put a sand dollar on here. And it's on it's a stamp that I made out of foam on a piece of cardboard, really simple. But it's on a stand, which might make it jiggle a little bit under here. We'll see. This may not show up because it's very light, but I'm going to give it a try anyway. Because there's a lot going on in this fabric, the design may not show as well. But it might be wonderful and subtle, and that's good too. Yeah, I like that. Kind of pretty. And use this design that I quilted. Let's see. I don't want the words, I just want the flower and the leaves. I was going to do it all in one color, but maybe I'll not use just one color. I can sort of see through here so I can see where I want the green. That's kind of fun. Now I have another stamp. This is like an overall pattern. Make a good background. Let's see if this green. Actually, let me get another green. See how this goes. And this is just another stamp that I made. This being foam instead of cutting rubber, it's really easy to make foam stamp. I like even with the lines here that are not the solid colored in leaf. I kind of like that. It's very subtle. It's pretty. Okay, now that I'm going to go through some of the heat setting. These have already been done. I spritzed them with the mister bottle, let them kind of do a little something, and then I heat set them again. This is the part of the shell rubbing I showed you earlier. I'm going to see what happens to that. I'm not even going to heat set it at this point. I'm going to just leave it the way it is and spritz it, and then I will press over it. And you can let it just keep going. If you get it really wet, the design will probably, depending on your fabric, hold some of the design. And then I will press it to lock it in. But again, I'm not going to use this in anything that needs to be washed. I'm only doing the fabric that I know can take the heat at this point. So again, the water is activating the color, and my spray bottle doesn't have a real good aim. Because this is in between paper, there's a good chance that's not drying it totally, so you might want to either put it between pressing cloth. Just always make sure you're protecting your iron and your surface. Or you can just let it dry, which is what I'm going to let those do. Now this is the piece that was muslin. is muslin and had all those different designs on it. And I'm going to, I think I'm going to do half of this. I'm going to heat set half of this, and we're going to see if it, let's see, which way should I go? See if it makes a difference. I'm going to go this way. So I'm just going to melt the crayon, the pastel rather, on this side. Makes a difference on letting it cool and things like that too, but we're just playing around. So I know it's going to really activate this side because it hasn't had any heat on it, but we'll see if it does the same on this side. Again, your surface, the fabric you're using, all that makes a difference. How much water you use. You can see this has stayed a little tighter and this immediately started to bloom. But isn't that pretty, all those colors brightening up? So to get it to stop, a little faster anyway, now I think with this piece, different things could happen because this has a lot of paint on it. It's still pretty soft, but it does have a lot of layers of paint. I don't think I'm going to get this one wet. I'm going to just heat it, see if that brightens it up a little bit. I don't really want that to, although it might look like it was underwater if I did. I'm going to leave that one just like it is. I really think that's pretty. Now on the silk, actually I think I'm going to do this before I heat set it. I'm going to get it wet. We'll see what it does. And I have this in a project I'll show you. So that's not quite dry. I'm going to flip it over. It's like, well, I'll show you what I used it in, and then you'll see what that made me think of. Also, if you're concerned about breathing any of this, just keep that in mind and either wear a mask or work in a ventilated area. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to try a piece of fabric on top of this. It may transfer, but I'm okay with that. So I'm just heat setting it. I haven't applied any water to it yet. And I'm only doing the flower at this point. Yeah, it didn't transfer any. Now I'm going to put it on here. My paper's curled, but that's okay. Now I'm just spritzing, misting. This was a very subtle green, so even misted, it doesn't look especially bright. That one stayed really stable, I'm surprised. You see it's still wet. Those were fun. Now I'm going to turn my iron down. And I don't know how these synthetics are going to react. Well, the silk I don't think it was the best rubbing. Blue on a blue stamp was not the best idea. So I'm going to just take that fabric again and lay it on here. And that transferred a lot of that pastel off of there. I don't know, I guess I'm tempted to try this. What have I got to lose? It's just a little piece. See if that does much of anything. That blue is just from what was transferred when I heat set it the first time. It's really not moving, so that surprises me. So that was silk organza. Did transfer a lot of the pastel onto this fabric. There's the design still there though. I wouldn't love that. I do. I'll show these some stamps on the organza in the pieces I'm going to share, and I actually painted those and stamped them. I think that is much better for the organza. But here's the synthetic organza. This one I'm going to lay this fabric on. I don't know, my iron's pretty hot. I could be melting everything, and that will be the end of that. Well, that made a pretty cool transfer onto my fabric, and it would have worked on paper. It might still work on paper. Let's give it a try. Yeah, it actually did. So the organza is not, oops, the organza is not holding that wax pastel all that great, but, and I don't know if there's a right or wrong to this. It's very sparkly compared to the silk organza. It's really kind of pretty. This one surprised me, and I'm not thrilled with it, but it's okay. This fabric's too wiggly. I don't really love it. I'm probably going to get this on my iron, but that's okay. This iron's just for this kind of projects. Took a little bit off, but not much. Now we're going to spritz it and see what happens. Not really bleeding any. There's not a clean paper here. Well, it does look kind of pretty in the end. That's pretty fabric. I'm going to show you 3 of the pieces that I've done using some of the techniques in this series. And these are just done on temporarily on a canvas panel. But they could be displayed a lot of different ways. On this I used the stencil and did the wash. And this is organza, and even though I did a rubbing in the series, this one happens to be stamped with paint. And I usually burn the edge, but on this one I used paint. I used a little thread work on the body and some beadwork for the head. This is painted cheesecloth. These circles have the rubbing technique, and it's a little blurred, and I like the idea of it looking kind of like water moving. And I also did a little bit of French knots and just a simple straight stitch. Here's another one, and again I organza and painted, stamped and painted a little bit on there with a little embroidery, cheesecloth again for the leaves. The background was a fabric that I used for a different technique, and it was left over, so I used it and did the stamping and a little bit of wash on the background. Then this rubbing was done on a screen, and I did it darker in an area and then got lighter because I knew I was going to probably cut it into the shape of petals. And then just a little bit more embroidery to hold those pieces on. And if bright's not your thing, I have this last piece that instead of doing the stencil and then making a wash, I did the wash. That's why a little extra water gives you these really cool, looks textural in the fabric. And then I did the stencil. This is the rubbing that I did on silk in the example in the series number 6. And then I did some embroidery, a little fraying. This is stained, coffee stained cheesecloth. And then I did with ink, I just drew a little bee on a piece of mulberry paper and added a few stitches and French knots. If you like this series, I hope you'll give some of the techniques a try. And if you did like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed, I hope you will. Be sure and tap the bell so you get notifications for my newest videos. This has been Ann. Thanks a lot for watching.